All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome into the Co-opting AI space, the last co-opting event for 21. A very eventful year for sure, and one that kind of has us all a little bit tired at the end of it. I'm just going to wait a couple of minutes, one or two, for everybody to settle in, take the virtual seat, which hopefully is your couch with a drink or a snack so you can enjoy our conversation tonight. We have a wonderful session lined up, which, as I just shared with our wonderful panel, I've been meaning to do for a while, not least because advertising is infrastructural to artificial intelligence, to large-scale data collection, data analysis, and the culture of prediction. And so while you take a seat and settle in, I'm just gonna kick us off because we have a lot of wonderful contributions tonight. So formally, hello all. Thank you so much for being here, for sharing the space with us tonight. Welcome, as I said, to the last 21 episode of Co-opting AI. This past year, I've been really fortunate to host many fantastic scholars who spoke on very urgent and interesting topics related to artificial intelligence. We started off with an event focused on security, then we had one on games, one on intimacy, on ideology, on music, on space exploration, on religion, and the last one was on reproduction. Now, today we'll be focusing on a phenomenon that has somewhat given birth to the omnipresent socio-technical phenomenon that Shoshana Zuboff calls trading in behavioral futures, advertising. My name is Dr. Mona Sloane. I am a sociologist, a qualitative researcher. I'm based at NYU, where I study the intersection of design, society, and technology with a focus on artificial intelligence design and policy. I am a fellow at the Institute for Public Knowledge, which is hosting us and you tonight. I'm also a senior research scientist at NYU Center for Responsible AI, and I am faculty at Tandon's School of Engineering at NYU, where I have the absolute pleasure of teaching the next generation of engineers. Here at the Institute for Public Knowledge, or IPK, I have founded and currently convene the Co-opting AI series, at which point I want to underline that co-opting AI would not be possible with the very generous and continued support of the Institute for Public Knowledge, the 370J Project, the NYU Center for Responsible AI, and of course, the Department of Technology, Culture, and Society at NYU 10. And thank you so much for your ongoing support. I also, for this one, want to extend a big thank you to Dr. Devin Powers and Dr. Angèle Christin, who have both been very kind enough to lend me their expertise for learning more about the topic and for putting together today's event. Before we begin our conversation with provocations and contributions from panelists, I want to acknowledge that I am currently standing on the unceded land of the Lenape peoples. I ask you to join me in acknowledging the Lenape community and the indigenous communities in whose land you may be currently located, and to commit to beginning the process of working to dismantle the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism. I also want to express our commitment to the ongoing project to tackle white privilege and systemic racism, and to develop an anti-racist culture in our communities and institutions, and in the academy specifically. Now, advertising as a social, a cultural, an economic, and a political practice has, since its inception, built on the idea that people can be put into boxes and that these boxes make collective and individual behavior more predictable. These boxes often are based on sometimes crude distinctions made that are made based on some social constructs that we use to organize and to stratify society. That can be race, gender, class, ethnicity, religion, sexuality, age, and many more, and of course, their intersections. In advertising, these categories may not be used in the same way. We may, for example, encounter vocabularies and taxonomies that focus on taste or demographics. So it's a little bit of a different kind of vocabulary. These distinctions and their numerous combinations, and Spotify, I recently learned, uses hundreds and thousands of taste buckets to provide personal recommendations, underpin the business of prediction and advertising. And that business is really big. It is what the extraordinary and obscene wealth of tech companies is built on, rather than having started as ventures that bring us Mars missions or cloud computing or autonomous vehicles. Google, Facebook, Amazon, and so forth started off and are still fundamentally concerned with selling us socks, books, or kitchen utensils. To give you an idea about scale, Apple's newish app tracking transparency feature, which now lets iOS users grant or deny apps permission to track their activity, has been estimated to have cost Snap, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube as much as $9.85 billion in lost revenue in the second half of 21. In comparison, the government of the biggest European economy, Germany, had an annual 21 budget of 413 billion. Now, clearly, advertising, and particularly automated targeting, is about centralizing power in all sorts of ways. It has an insatiable appetite for enmeshing social categorization and discrimination even further within capitalist motives. That means that in order to understand automated targeting, big tech, and AI vis-a-vis the amplification of social and racial inequalities, we must turn to the sociocultural history, as well as its interpretation of the future. And so today, I am very fortunate to host a very distinguished panel who will guide us through this exploration. Dr. Roopali Mukherjee, Dr. Keith Wei-Liu, and Dr. Matthew Crane. Starting us off will be the latter, Dr. Matthew Crane, who currently is Assistant Professor of Media, Journalism, and Film at Miami University. He writes and teaches about the transformation of media and advertising systems in the digital age, with an emphasis on the political economy of internet technologies and consumer surveillance. His book, Profit Over Privacy: How Surveillance Advertising Conquered the Internet, is out now. This is out from University of Minnesota Press. Terrific book. It gives data-driven advertising an origin story. It looks closely at the political contests of the 90s that laid the foundation for today's surveillance advertising economy. Dr. Crane also teaches courses covering subjects such as digital media and culture, media industries, media history and policy, intellectual property, and media technologies. Following Dr. Crane will be Dr. Roopali Mukherjee, who is a critical race scholar of media. She's the author of 2 books, The Blackening Factory, Brand Culture, and the Technologies of the Racial Self, which is also with University of Minnesota Press, currently in press, so we're eagerly awaiting this one. She also authored The Racial Order of Things, Cultural Imaginaries of the Post-Soul Era, which was also with Minnesota in 2006. She's also the co-editor of Racism Postrace, out with Duke in 2019, and Commodity Activism, Cultural Resistance in Neoliberal Times, which was with NYU Press in 2012. She teaches undergraduate courses on media criticism and activist media, and graduate courses on cultural studies, research methods, and social justice. And closing us off will be Dr. Keith Andrew Wei-Liu, who is the Henry Putnam University Professor of History and Public Affairs at Princeton University, where he teaches in the Department of History and the School of Public and International Affairs. He's former chair of the Department of History, the former vice dean of the School of Public and International Affairs, and current president of the American Association for the History of Medicine. He's an award-winning author on drugs and drug policy, race, science and health, and genetics and society, and he's also known for insightful public writing and media commentaries on history of medicine, pandemics and society, and medical affairs in the US. In 21, he received the Dan David Prize for his influential body of historical scholarship focused on race, science, and health equity, on the social implications of medical innovation, and on the politics of disease. Congratulations. This year, he was also elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He too has a terrific new book out with University of Chicago Press called Big Tobacco, Racial Marketing, and the Untold Story of Menthol Cigarettes. Terrific book as well out now. Please join me in welcoming this absolutely stellar panel. As always, 2 seconds of housekeeping. We will hear for about 5 to 7, maybe 10 minutes from each panelist. Then we will have a short kind of conversation between us. Meanwhile, please put all the questions and comments that you have into the Q&A section of the webinar, because I will very quickly turn over to the Q&A part and relay your questions, your curiosity, your comments to the panelists as I navigate us through this conversations. We'll be streaming this onto Twitter, and we also have closed captions available. And with that, I'm going to stop talking and with gratitude hand it over to Dr. Crane. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us tonight.
Wow, what a great introduction. Thank you, Mona, and all the folks at IPK for this invitation. It's doubly great to be on this panel with Rupali because we are former colleagues and a dear friend I haven't seen in ages. So Mona asked me to start with a brief overview of surveillance advertising and then talk a little bit about its intersection with AI. After that, I'm going to talk a little bit about my historical work, and then finally a little bit about maybe how an approach to thinking about surveillance advertising as social relations can help us understand some of the ways in which surveillance advertising companies create particular harms based on their business. So I'm going to share my screen here. Okay. So surveillance advertising. This is a form of advertising that really boils down to using data to try to find increasingly effective ways to predict and then influence people's behaviors and attitudes. So the key actors in this space are not only the large platforms like Google and Facebook, but the huge number of advertising buyers and sellers that the platforms connect and then plug into the surveillance advertising infrastructure, enabling a lot of data collection and sharing among a wide variety of actors. Surveillance advertising relies on a vast infrastructure of data collection, data exchange, and information processing, and it facilitates billions and billions of transactions every single day. A key part of surveillance advertising I want to highlight for this particular talk and this particular conversation is audience segmentation or micro-targeting. So this is really about carving people into addressable groups in vast number of permutations on behalf of whoever your paying customer might be. And then finally, a good thing to know is that the data generated in surveillance advertising processes are notoriously slippery. Once compiled and coagulated, information about groups and individuals are used for all kinds of downstream purposes, from business intelligence to credit scoring to being sold to the government to help facilitate warrantless arrests. Once the data is collected and used for a primary purpose, it takes on a life of its own through a vast kind of unregulated market of data brokerage and data selling. So how does surveillance advertising interact with artificial intelligence? This group probably knows a lot more about AI than I do, but AI means a lot of different things in different contexts. So one way to understand the intersection of surveillance advertising and AI is to think about AI, at least in part, as systems for automated decision-making and systems of prediction. And if that's the case, then ad platforms fit the bill very well. So surveillance advertising platforms use decision-making and prediction systems in what is called programmatic advertising. Programmatic advertising does a lot of things. Most notably, it automates business tasks like the buying and selling of ads. And it also claims to optimize a whole range of campaign elements, such as who to target, when to target them, how much ads should be sold and bought for, et cetera. So these systems are all about predicting the likelihood of a user behavior, something like a click or a sign up, and then trying to optimize for that particular result. And then increasingly, it's also about tracking beyond the click to demonstrate that an outcome happened as a result of an ad. All of this lends itself to increasingly invasive and connective surveillance infrastructures so that marketers can be persuaded that their dollars spent on surveillance advertising campaigns produce a return on investment. On the surveillance side, automation is used to compile data, to infer things about individuals in order to sort them into groups or segments. So ad platforms and data brokers use machine learning techniques to do this work of social sorting more effectively. So just to prove I'm not too proud to plug my own book, this is a little bit about the research that I've been engaged in. And I want to talk about the history of surveillance advertising. So surveillance advertising has become the de facto model, the business model for digital communications. And it's fast becoming the business model for television and the rest of ad-supported media as well. So I won't spend any time really elaborating the sheer magnitude of consumer surveillance. It's pretty common knowledge now, and you'll just have to trust me that it's very big, global spanning infrastructure. So my book really tries to answer the question, how did we get to this point? And the absolute Cliff Notes version of this history, and I should say that as a pseudo-historian who lives for the crunchy details, it's actually very painful for me to summarize a book, a history in this way, but I'm going to do my best. The summary is really that surveillance advertising on the internet didn't begin with Google or Facebook. It began in the 1990s, before anyone really knew what the internet was going to be. So back then, it was this kind of nebulous collection of new technologies that was called a bunch of things like the information superhighway. And it wasn't necessarily going to be on computers, and it wasn't necessarily going to be networked computers. There were a whole range of now dead technologies like CD-ROMs in the mix on what this new kind of media wave was going to be. So what stands out when we look at this period and the early discussions around bringing advertising to this new medium is that the specifics of the tech didn't actually matter that much. What mattered was that the new media, whatever shape it was going to take, was going to be commercialized, and in particular, it was going to be supported by advertising dollars. So interestingly enough, the advertising industry proper, the big ad conglomerates on Madison Avenue, they were really the last to get on board bringing advertising to the new media. They were fine with the way things were, cashing big checks from big marketers to create television ads. It was marketers themselves, AKA the people holding the purse and controlling ad spending, in conjunction with speculative .com bubble investors and federal policymakers, that really found common ground in commercializing the internet as fast as possible and with as little regulatory oversight or consumer protection as possible. Once it became clear that the internet and the personal computer and not some form of interactive television or other type of new media was going to become what the information superhighway was going to coalesce into this thing called the internet, it took very little time for advertising to come on board because of these early steps that were taken to set out a policy and business framework that was sort of already in place to jump on board and bring advertising to a medium that had heretofore been entirely outside of the commercial space. So many in these early discussions, particularly at the policy level, understood, and my research really goes to great pains to demonstrate that people knew that if we unleashed advertising on this new medium, this computerized medium, which was very, very good at capturing and collecting information, that a whole range of privacy problems were very likely to be unleashed. So it wasn't that people had no idea what was coming down the pike in regards to the future of surveillance advertising. It was rather that the prevailing notion of the time was that free markets were going to sort out any problems that would arise. So the government's position on behalf of what I call the marketing complex was really to let the private sector lead the deployment of the internet's commercialization and advertising in particular, under the assumption that the only way to have a free communication system is to have it be advertising supported, and that if people have problems with particular privacy practices, they'll be able to simply go to a competitor who has practices that are more compatible with their privacy values. Spoiler alert, this did not pan out very well at all, unless, of course, you're a baron of surveillance advertising, in which case this whole thing is going very great for you. So my book kind of tells the origin story of surveillance advertising as a mixture of public policy decisions and business imperatives coalescing at a time really before we understood what the internet was going to be specifically. So here's my provocation, and I really love that the kind of call for this was to talk about, to bring something sort of unique or maybe even a little provocative to the conversation. So I'm going to try to do that by just saying, drawing on this historical research that I've been doing, here's my provocation for thinking about surveillance advertising systems today and their outcomes. So I think what we need to think about is deliberately decentering the technology in our analysis. And instead to focus on the social relations, not only of a technology's deployment and use, but those that underpinned its historical development in the crucial period of decision-making before a technology goes mainstream. So we can apply this to surveillance advertising or perhaps the component AI systems on which it depends. So what would it look like if I started again at the top of this brief slideshow to define surveillance advertising not as a technology, but think through it from the lens of social relations. So we can take each word on its own. Surveillance is more than watching or being watched. It is an unequal ordering of social relations around access to information. Likewise, advertising is more than a TV spot or a digital ad that follows you around. It is a political economic structure for media and communication systems. Just knowing that a medium is supported by advertising already tells us a lot about how that system was designed and who it is meant to serve. So decentering the technology does not mean ignoring it. It means going back to the social construction of technology approach to think about social relations made concrete through technological infrastructures. So in my work, I've tended to focus on how surveillance advertising expresses the exploitative social relations of our prevailing political economy. So surveillance advertising is really a creature of public policy, or as media scholar Des Friedman says, negative policy, or the absence of policy. And it's also a creature of capitalism. It stems from the important role that advertising came to play over the course of the 20th century in supporting a commercial media system and generating demand for consumer goods for an incredibly productive industrial capitalism. It stems from the broad push towards investment in information and communication technologies beginning in the 1970s to combat stagnation, or what Brenner's famously calls the long downturn. And the reason the net is a surveillance hellscape is not because Google or Facebook are uniquely evil, or because they build magically powerful tech that manipulates us and brainwashes us, or as Cory Doctorow calls it a mind control ray. The reason we have a surveillance hellscape online is that marketers acted forcefully to shape policy in their interests to ensure that new media would be a tool for selling, and that policymakers who were quite aware of the privacy problems to come were persuaded that market dynamics would solve rather than exacerbate surveillance-related harms. So surveillance advertising is a remapping and an acceleration of the social relations produced by capitalist media systems and the uniquely anti-democratic communications policymaking history in the United States. So just a few more points, and then I will happily conclude. Decentering tech means that we should focus on continuity just as much as change. We need to understand that even with strong structural inertia, no outcome was inevitable. There were decisions that were made by people on the ground, weighing costs and benefits to lay the groundwork for the framework that seems so immovable today. And lastly, we should be wary of limiting our analysis to the task of proving specific harms. And perhaps this is the most provocative piece, because this is crucially important. And I do not want to downplay the real harms that are enacted on individuals' lives, often in very unequal stratification, right? But a lot of the current conversation around surveillance advertising boils down to the powerful effects of this or that manipulative strategy or technique or technology. But in some ways, whether advertising works or not is beside the point. What kind of social relations does surveillance advertising reproduce? And what structural imperatives flow from this design? We have an entire communications landscape with so much promise and potential that has been built upon a business model that erodes privacy, demands social sorting for the generation of consumption, and sells the promise of influencing publics. So when we think about harms, we should think not only about direct individual harms, but the broader social costs and social relations that a surveillance advertising dominated internet exacts. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. A lot of food for thought and material for the conversation later. Rupali, can I hand over to you?
Yes. Thank you, Matt. I'm not surprised by the richness. I don't think you sacrificed that much of the granular detail of the history, so I really appreciate it. And it turns out that we may actually be talking, at least at points in time, about the same thing. So I'm going to take a slightly different tack on this. And part of what I'm doing is de-emphasizing the technology, as Matt suggests we do, and sort of to try and focus. I'm also going to try and do a kind of bad history, Keith, just to give you fair warning on this. But to try and think about a certain set of linkages and trajectories that are as much about shifts, historical shifts, as they are about continuities. And the emphasis, from my point of view, is there's a lot more focus on shifts and breaks and less on continuity. And what this emphasis on breaks as opposed to continuities does is that it discourages people from actually tracking contemporary phenomena to certain kinds of, through certain kinds of epistemic discursive history. So I'm going to try and do a little bit of that today. So hi, everybody. I don't really like webinars because I have no idea who's there and who's not there, but I presume that people are there, and I thank you for being here and for coming. Thanks to Zari and Sam and to everybody at NYU's Institute for Public Knowledge, to Keith and Matt for being here, and especially to Mona Sloane who makes this urgent and insightful series of conversations possible. Thank you, Mona, for inviting me to today's event. So much of what I propose to do in the next 5 minutes, because I took that very seriously, so I'm going to literally try and stick to 5 minutes, draws from my next book called The Blacking Factory, The Brand in Racial Capitalism. But you will also hear echoes of familiar voices, a number of whom are featured on previous episodes of the Co-opting AI series. I was delighted to see so many names that I respect and learn so much from. The book, in essence, proposes a critical race genealogy of the brand and the brand itself. The point, which will be familiar to many of you, is to push back against peculiarly deracialized and presentist theories of something called the neoliberal brand itself, and instead to take seriously Achille Mbembe's view of the current moment in capitalism as that of the, quote, becoming Black of the world. The point, in other words, is to reimagine histories of technology, capitalism, and the human by starting elsewhere. So I know that's huge and big, and I'm not going to meet any of the challenges that throws out there, but I'm going to try. So to start elsewhere, what do we bring into view when we recognize how race and gendered histories inscribe the brand? That is, in essence, the question that I have taken up in this book. So let me list a couple of things that become visible, that come into view when we, in fact, acknowledge specifically race and gendered histories of social constructs like the brand. It becomes possible, first of all, to understand seeing, not as innocent or innocuous, but as Judith Butler suggests, as a racial grammar, a historical schema of interpretation through which we recognize, assess, consume, and control difference. Second, it urges us to track these relations of visibility and visuality within the longue durée of what Cedric Robinson terms racial capitalism, and specifically to understand capital's abiding interest, not in abstracting labor and exploitation as Marx had believed, but as Lisa Lowe suggests, in emphasizing difference and making it useful, manageable, and profitable for capital's own purposes. Tracking market uses to which selfhood and difference have long been put, it becomes possible to track a series of entanglements, linking, for example, the searing of flesh as a mark of property, the permanent scarring or tattooing of skin as a signifier of ownership, with the brand's significance with the advent of mass production and mass consumption as a symbolic designation of quality, uniqueness, and exclusivity. But then in turn, in the current moment, meanings of brand shift in a reversal of sorts from objects we must consume to objects we must become. And so I am interested in thinking not just about shifts along trajectories like these, but also to think about what comes into view when we think about continuities linking these sort of shifts in how we think about things like marketization of personhood, advertising, and the category that we now know as the brand. Contemporary repertoires of, say, for example, Black allure and stigma. So think here about the various ways in which Blackness has been packaged, reproduced, and marketed via the culture industries, but also Black stigma. Think about boom sectors of carceral capitalism, the prison industrial complex, so on and so forth. Think about the ways in which Blackness monetizes these sectors and the ways in which branded versions of Blackness do a lot of this work. And to not think about these race and gendered histories is to think about the brand, certainly the neoliberal brand, in ways that absolutely effaces these specifically race and gendered histories. That's basically what I'm trying to do in this book. So these contemporary repertoires of Black allure and stigma, which are driving these boom sectors of culture industries, to think about continuities is to think about these boom sectors as they are imprinted with the vocabularies of marketized personhood and what Anne McClintock has termed commodity racism from the early 19th centuries. So we're talking now about the Aunt Jemimas of the world and the Uncle Bens of the world. And the ways in which these practices, these vocabularies, these conceptual schema is practices of the self suited to the logics of extraction and exploitation so that it becomes a self-fulfilling sort of prophecy in some senses, because this is the way in which visibility and visuality form the self, give people practices of the self. I'm not saying that they are exhaustive in terms of practices of the self, but they form a pretty wide range of versions, iterations of branded selves that are useful to capital and so have the longest shelf life, as it were, within cultural economies. Enactments of the self, and people like Herman Gray and lots of other people are now talking about how we submit to these enactments. We willingly enlist ourselves to these economies of visibility. These enactments of the branded self track protocols of mass manufacture, I'm saying, as well as practices of consumption, again, mass consumption. And this then produces an ecology of eaters and the eaten. So this is Kyla Tompkins's language here. There are the hungry, she says, and then there are those who do not go down easily and rather bite back. So there's a whole sort of ecology of selves produced by these market discourses, by the sorting of people, as Mona and Matt have mentioned already, into this is who you are. And then one has to think about the ways in which these versions of the human are constitutive of human beings in and of themselves, so the self-fulfilling thing. The question then is not whether, but how these ratio-historical schema embed what now emerges, as if for the first time, as the neoliberal brand itself, and how, within this longue durée, technologies of ambient surveillance, data mining, algorithmic advertising, surveillance advertising. I learned so much from Matt's talk, how these technologies track capital's formidable and enduring interest in managing and monetizing racial-gender difference. Certainly, there are a number, and it pleases me to say that there are a number of critical race scholars, everyone from Simone Brown to Ruha Benjamin, Charlton McElwain, Sophia Noble, Andre Brock. It's wonderful how many names there are in this line, have mapped the racial ontologies of quote unquote scientific systems of automated assessment and what Oscar Gandy many years ago called rational discrimination. So as with the ratio-gendered schema of the brand itself, these technologies reveal to us capital's abiding investments in the amplification and the exploitation of forms of difference. That's generally the gist of what I had to say.
Thank you so much, Rupali, Dr. Mukherjee, for this terrific contribution. More food for thought and on my post-its, and I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Raylu Keith. Please, over to you.
Terrific. So I will also try to be brief and mention that I'm just providing a quick overview of the themes of my book as they intersect with the comments already made by Matthew and Rupali. And thank you again for the invitation. And what I thought I would do is reflect on the book I just published called Pushing Cool: Big Tobacco, Racial Marketing, and the Untold Story of the Menthol Cigarette in relationship to the questions of tracking, surveillance, and in fact, branding, as Rupali just mentioned. So just a very quick overview of the book itself. It is in many respects the story of a kind of brand of cigarette, or a number of different kinds of brands of mentholated cigarettes, the story I tell, that emerged at a time of increased smoking activity, and in a world in which smokers themselves were experiencing what's called smoker's throat in the 1920s and 40s. This is an interesting moment in the history of corporate capitalism, in which I write that the menthol cigarette emerges as Stuart Ewan, the historian of corporate capitalism, once described, it hoped to profit by the attack on its own failures. That is to say, the failures of the cigarette were going to be a profit nexus for mentholated smoking, the promise of anesthetic value coming with a particular kind of medicated smoking. Now, it should be pointed out that there is fundamental deceit in the claim that that mentholated smoking is anything other than a sensation. It has no anesthetic. It has no medical or therapeutic value. What I do in the book is track how health anxieties around cigarette smoking also enhance the value of mentholated smoking, so that mentholated smoking actually profits from the anxieties associated with non-menthol smoking, and how that tracks market segmentation, and how in the 1960s in particular, this kind of promise of a health-related smoke also becomes racialized. This is pretty well known in the scholarship, and how a particular strain of racial capitalism becomes associated with menthol smoking as companies begin to track and to think about not just menthol markets as youth markets or as health-oriented markets, but as poverty market. So I want to actually just dwell down on this particular moment in the history of mentholated smoking, at which point the menthol race affinity begins to be a kind of a core cultural narrative in marketing and advertising, such that images like this you see here, where the idea of menthol as authentically Black is built and constructed. And I want to then talk very quickly about how a critique of that emerges, such that we are at the cusp of actually banning menthol cigarettes today. So a lot of what explains the history of menthol smoking is about the history of tracking. And what I'll do, I'll skip past the first two chapters to talk about the rise of a corpus, a cohort of social scientists that focus on conducting focus groups, psychographic studies, street corner interviews to understand social status anxiety, all of these health worries, how they are gendered, perceptions of the self, in order to inform advertising themes. And so what you begin to see in the 50s to the 60s is a shift from images like the one you see, this is from Leo Burnett, to images like you see of Elston Howard, the Yankees catcher, on the side of a building in Chicago advertising the menthol cigarette, and how that becomes these kinds of images associated with menthol in the 1970s. And I want to drill down on, you might say, the backstory, not just of tracking perception, but of secret forms of influence that predate advertising, that predate marketing, that come to us from advertising firms. For instance, one of the documents at the center of my study is one that's produced by the company Dancer, Fitzgerald and Sample, based on their studies in St. Louis. What you see here is the emergence of a particularly secretive predatory strain of racial capitalism. And I'll just sort of take you through this document, and I'll explain where these documents come from and as part of the history. What they write is that Camel menthols are having a hard time finding their way into the Negro market. And they say, this is to summarize our thoughts on the way to reach the Negro market for Camel menthol, and specifically what we recommend doing now in the Negro areas of St. Louis. One of the things these documents talk about is tapping into generational tensions, that Negroes don't want what Daddy used to smoke or drink, that's old-fashioned, but also appealing to Black pride of the 1960s, which is focused on rejecting white standards. The Negro, says this document, no longer look to the white market and its purchasing norms and habits to set the pace in what to buy. Again, Negroes are becoming increasingly proud of the fact that they are Negroes, and that they are now rejecting many of the standards or patterns set by the white community. So what marketers and advertisers were trying to understand is how the very essence of social protest and group status distinctions was creating new markets. But they weren't just content to observe. They were also interested in how you use secret processes to generate markets. And so this is the part of this document that I find particularly fascinating and also disturbing. And they write, in both working and social situations, Negroes tend to gravitate to groups, and Negro men usually spend more time with their respective groups than the average white man, whether it's in bars, club meetings, etc. Within these groups, they say there are centers of influence, individuals who lead the others because they are more in the know or more forceful. These are not leaders in the typical sense of being presidents of the PTA and etc. These are like the barbers and the bellhops and the bartenders, people who are best at spreading the news, who have a strong desire for class and status. And it's these people that we present boast material to into these cell groups. We impart prestige and factual knowledge in a personalized, almost secret manner in addition to the product itself. This is about handing out free samples. What I find here is interesting is the kind of surreptitious secret way in which advertising is done, markets are created. What allows me in this book to track the history of this process, to look behind the curtain, so to speak, is the lawsuits by states' attorneys generals and the federal government of the tobacco industry in the 1990s that because of the discovery process allows us to understand the consultants, the hidden persuaders, the economists, the urban studies scholars, the ones who actually make this process happen. And they themselves are interested in visibility, in transformations of visibility. And really this speaks to one of the things that both Matt and Rupali just mentioned, which is that even when the regulators become wise to certain forms of marketing, like television being a suspect vehicle for advertising tobacco, and banned television ads, they pivot to urban billboards. The book also tells the story of how this intensive advertising presence in urban context grows, but also how local activists and public health advocates begin to take aim at the proliferation of urban billboards. One of the characters in the book is this vigilante named Henry McNeil Brown, who in Chicago actually painted over billboards with alcohol and tobacco in this time period, and also missteps by the industry. For instance, coming out with a black-only brand called Uptown that really laid the groundwork for controversy that ultimately culminated in the billboard bans. So I'll just end by saying that, what's fascinating is to be able to, because of the lawsuits, look behind the curtain to understand through this 14 plus million documents that are housed at UCSF and searchable by any of us from our computer, to understand the processes by which advertising is married to marketing and social surveillance and focus groups through social science research that allows advertising to move beyond television bans, beyond billboard bans, and actually then to become part of the new media environment that both Matt and Rupali have discussed. I could say a lot more, but I will end there. And I look forward to chatting.
Thank you so much, Keith. Thank you, Rupali. Thank you, Matt, for these absolutely thought-provoking contributions. I'm gonna step back and invite people to add their comments to the Q&A section in the chat. And before I look into that, I want to invite our panelists to ask questions to one another, or perhaps comment on each other's provocations. I saw, taking the cue of continuities, I saw wonderful continuities, and that got me thinking in a almost geeky way about certain theories that I'm currently trying to grapple with, and empirical material that I'm looking at, and of course also the policy discourse that we're being currently being confronted with when it comes to regulating artificial intelligence systems, both domestically and also abroad and transnationally, as these are global markets. So I want to invite the panelists to comment, perhaps on each other's provocations before we turn to audience questions, and I already see a few coming in.
So I guess I had a question for Matt and for Rupali, which is that I think of myself as, in some ways, telling the backstory or a precursor story to what you both have described in the rise of surveillance, these kinds of surveillance practices. And I wondered how you think about the precursors to the stories that you have unfolded.
I mean, if I can jump in, what's interesting to me, Keith, based on your work, is this sort of the word of mouth, the boast material, these community sort of quote unquote leaders as a news spreading machine, and so that. There's a way in which there are multiple systems of advertising at work here, so that by the time Madison Avenue gets in on the action, I mean, there's some action that Madison Avenue is not interested in even getting in on. So part of the book deals with the 1930s context, with the decision by General Motors to sell Cadillacs to African Americans. And so you have this incredible moment where they're not advertising because they're very concerned about Cadillacs being resignified as a Negro car. Mm-hmm. So they have to be very careful not to openly make those associations. And yet there is this whole network of word of mouth, Black elites. I mean, so Ebony starts publishing in the mid 40s, but the reason why GM starts to agree to sell undercover to Black folk in the 30s is because Black people are bringing Cadillacs in for service. And suddenly they realize there's a lot of Cadillacs that Black people are not technically allowed to buy because that's company policy, but they clearly have the cars and they're bringing it in. So the thing that I find really incredible in terms of the sort of pre-story, as it were, is these word of mouth, in elite circles and whatever I'm not subscribing to theories about copying white versions of social status and stature. There's other things. This is much more complicated than just that. But it interests me that you have actually managed to track in the sort of tactics and strategies of the manufacturers and the advertisers, their sort of mapping of this geography of leaders, and just get the samples to these guys, and then a bunch of other people will probably do it because they signify cool, and they're not like daddy cool, they're like now cool, and all of those things. So that's the part that interests me in some of what you said, because it's relevant even today. What do you do on social media to get people to buy that next iPhone or the next music, whatever it's, to make it sort of Black cool? And how do you make something Black cool is you have Black people acting Black in terms of these sort of histories of branded selves. They do certain things, and some of it is useful to capital to sell whatever crap capital is trying to sell us. So, I mean, it was very useful for me, the presentation.
If I could add, I would completely agree. I think what you have there, Keith, is a prehistory of the influencer in some ways, but demonstrating Rupali's and my point about continuity rather than change, right? And especially when you dive into some of the particular segmentation tactics that are made available in surveillance advertising infrastructures, a lot of it is about, maybe not framed directly in these terms, but what it's about is exploiting perceived weaknesses and vulnerabilities that help make the sale, right? And one of the ways that is becoming kind of increasingly prevalent is about exploiting intercultural divisions among different groups of people. And it seems to me kind of that's a really interesting history that I knew nothing about. It's kind of an example of status, trying to ascertain and exploit status dynamics in order to make that sell. So the difference today would be, you could extrapolate just that one tactic, ad infinitum, based on inferences rather than direct observations. But that's really not that different from pioneering a strategy in East St. Louis and then rolling it out nationwide. So yeah, very interesting.
Yeah, and if I were to just add one quick observation, because John H. Johnson is the publisher at Ebony, is such a central figure, I just want to share with you one slide that I didn't use, just to give you a sense of his role in this. His ideas were very central to the kind of advertising dynamic of the time, and he had this sort of theory about what kinds of status anxiety were part of the experience of segregation. And he wrote about how, for Black people, patronizing a first-class eating establishment in a comfortable manner is not always easy. And so therefore, Negro Americans with means, who are forced outside the mainstream of American life in so many ways, achieve what he called compensatory gratification in ways that are often quite surprising to the rest of America, which is why he would explain you have overconsumption, as in the purchase of status products like Cadillacs, and underconsumption. And what's fascinating to me and also shocking is the way in which the industry was highly attuned. I mean, they were, as I joke, I say they were doing, and this kind of reflects your work, Rupali, they're doing Black studies before Black studies actually exists as an academic field. In fact, they're doing gender studies too. They're interested in masculinity and health perception. And the last thing I'll add is their knowledge about communities is equally as fine-tuned as what we talk about with tracking our internet traffic. So for instance, they knew that if you have a Black associated product like Cool cigarettes and you're advertising on a bus, if that bus, they knew what the demographics of the bus traffic is in particular cities. So they knew they could advertise on the inside of the bus. But if those buses went through white neighborhoods, they would not advertise on the outside of the bus. And it varied from city to city based on their understandings of racism in different cities. So I find the precursor it's sort of a kind of deeply disturbing echo of the conversation that we have today about how we track movement in order to understand and produce, in some ways, markets.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that wonderful kind of addition. And I had the influencer kind of thought as well. And I appreciate also, Keith, that you show original material and kind of show the kind of theorizing that has happened among these communities of practice. I'm going to turn to the audience real quick and kind of synthesize what I see there. And I think what we kind of see in terms of curiosity from the audience is a question around power, social relations. So taking the cue from all three of you, that is the focus on social relations over the technology itself. So there's an interest in social relations and power and also agency. And so perhaps a good question that synthesizes the concerns of the audience is, on the one hand, how much emphasis should we give individual agency? Aren't people, doing this voluntarily, which to me ties into very important policy mechanisms that we see and logics that underpin those, which are, for example, around consent, informed consent. The GDPR in the EU is, really focused on that. So that's sort of one part of the question. The other part of the question just came in, and it is about advertisers who use their power to surveil, to take advantage of what they learn through artificial intelligence. So put kind of their categorization and knowledge, into scaling mode almost. Are they aware of their power, how they impact social relations? So individual agency and social relations in advertising, if each of you could respond to kind of these three keywords real quick before we close today. Rupali, maybe we'll start with you.
So I might have missed the last bit that you talked about, but this gets complicated because I want to loop back around to Keith's point about compensatory gratification, because on the one hand, I like Matt's argument that this is not about one person watching the other person. It's about who has more control in terms of predicting and therefore managing and controlling the other person's behavior, choices, tastes, whatever you want to call it. But what do you do when a large demographic has essentially been kept out so that there is a sort of fairly organic bubbling up from the grassroots desire, a very sort of, affect-laden desire to participate, particularly if participation through the marketplace is one of the few ways in which you get recognized as a real American. So particularly in the 30s, as Keith is saying, you can't buy a house in a segregated neighborhood. You can't sit down at a restaurant. We're talking about, the Jim Crow. So you buy a car, you buy a pack of cigarettes, you do certain kinds of things so that the question of consent becomes complicated at this moment, because on the one hand, you're being taken for a ride by capital. And on the other hand, this is one of the few avenues to articulate belonging, citizenship, status, standing, a number of things that are being deliberately, a group is being excluded from. So it's difficult to read consent as, 100% as a positive or a negative. What was the other thing that the question was about? I'm sorry, something about advertisers?
Yes, so the power of kind of analyzing these social relations, and if advertisers are aware of that and aware of the sort of long-term impact of their theorizing and their enactment of their theories in service of capitalism, as you just outlined.
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is we should know at least what they know as scholars, as analysts, as activists. But the slightly longer answer would be that the interesting thing about human beings and consumers is that they don't follow the rules. So that, the advertiser may know a particular kind of Black community in one or another way, or women as one or another kind of consumer, immigrants as one or another kind of consumer, but then consumer practices do all kinds of haywire, wonderfully, complicated things that sometimes, befuddled them as well. And so there's some hope to be taken from the possibility that however much human beings get boxed into these, market forms of the self, that human beings are nifty about maybe, wiggling out of the boxes that we get placed in. So I'll just leave it there.
Thank you so much. Matthew, do you want to take the cue, and then maybe Keith will close off with your response to this?
Yeah, these are especially the agency question is a very, very difficult question to respond to, especially briefly. I mean, I would kind of approach this and say, early policy said, we're going to let market preferences sort out privacy disputes, which takes, in other words, consumers are going to choose to do business with companies that they agree with in terms of data collection practices and all of that, which assumes that kind of privacy preferences and privacy values are kind of an a priori category that aren't also constituted by your very interactions with these systems, right? And so I remember 10 years ago when Zuckerberg famously said, privacy's dead or something along, privacy's dead, get over it, or we shouldn't care about privacy, or we can redefine privacy, right? And he wanted to redefine privacy as its opposite, which is sharing. So, I don't know how far, that complicates the question of agency when people are enacting their privacy values. It's sort of chicken and the egg question in some ways. And then, in terms of kind of to follow up on what Rupali was talking about, again, from a slightly different angle, like people will say, and often my students will say, look at this ad. It's so wrong. They don't know anything about me. This system is junk, and therefore I don't need to be concerned about it. And so, bring that into questions about racialized capitalism and whatnot, and participation in systems. Do you want to have a system know you wrong and then have decisions made upon wrong information, or do you want to be completely visible to a system and then potentially deal with consequences of that? I mean, that's a rock and a hard place, especially for minoritized groups, from my perspective.
Yeah, and I would just add by saying that, I work with a single case study, and there are lots of deep ironies around questions of power and agency and exploitation in this history. It doesn't really follow one line. So for instance, in 1960, most of the people in the industry would say, menthol smokers are, if you said that Black people preferred menthols, actually they didn't. They felt that people who were health anxious preferred menthols. And so the goal was to try to understand the nature of people's health anxiety and speak to that. But they always understood that there was an element of deep deception. So the question about agency it's one thing, but the other question of sort of what is being promised with the product, and to what extent the marketer understands that there is a kind of a deeply deceptive feature of what's being promised is another. The last thing I'll say is, within the industry itself and within those who are help to support these products, there are fascinating theories about human motivation. They speak about exploitation. One of the key characters is Ernest Dichter, who is the founder of a company called the Institute for Motivational Research. He's a Freudian, and he understands motivational research isn't about just understanding people's motivations. It's also understanding how to motivate people on the basis of understanding their anxieties. So the kind of psychological study of human behavior that is amassed in this archive and that is deployed relentlessly to shape behavior. It's one thing to talk about human agency, and it's another thing to understand the scale of the work that's being done at multiple registers to shape behavior along certain kinds of lines. And once you understand that, I think then we could have a discussion about agency. But right now it's more of a kind of a theoretical, like, there's markets and then there's agency. But if you really understand what's behind the curtain, it'll change the conversation about what agency actually looks like. And so what I want to encourage people to do is to actually just go on this website, truthtobacco.org, and you see the millions of documents, and you see the scale of work that's done to shape behavior and to sow and to create markets.
Thank you so much, Keith, for that call to look behind the curtain, which I'm going to take as a cue to close today's event. Thank you so much, Rupali Mukherjee, Matthew Crane, and Keith Willie, for terrific contributions today on co-opting AI and advertising. My gratitude to you, to our wonderful audience who came into the space today and shared it with us. We appreciate you. Of course, also huge appreciation of the terrific team, Jessica Coffey, Sam DeJohn, Zari Loom at IPK, but also our sponsors, Center for Responsible AI, 370J Project, and the wonderful Department of Technology, Culture, and Society at tandem. And with that, I'm gonna close today's event and let you know that we will actually have a spring programming of co-opting AI and key theory Q of understanding behavior and all of the cues shaping behavior. Our next event will be co-opting AI personality on personality testing, automated personality analysis in hiring, and all of these things. And with that, have a wonderful evening. Thank you, everybody, and see you next year. Have a great break. Thank you.
Thank you.